Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our virtual service with the First Parish Plymouth congregation. My name is Nicolette Chasse, and I am a member of the Music and Worship Committee. My pronouns are she and they. The first part of our service is recorded. Following the benediction, the recording will end. Then we will go into our candles of joy and concern. This section is not recorded. This service, as all of our services, will be posted on our Facebook page and on YouTube. Our service today is entitled The Lost Voices of Unitarian Women and is presented by our Reverend Art Lavoie. Our technical director is Paul Melville. In honor of Women's History Month and International Women's Day, which is tomorrow, all of the songs selected for today were written by women. We hope you stay for our virtual coffee hour after the service. Whoever you are, whomever you love, whatever you believe, wherever you are on your journey, let us walk together this hour. Our call to worship today is by Eliza Gordon. The church should make life beautiful, good, and true. Make life pure, refined, human. Reveal the inspiration of art, the marvel of music, the glory of literature. Lift men and women into the atmosphere of a rational religion and noble ethics. Our opening hymn for today is Dear Weavers of Our Lives, written by Nancy Dorian. It is number 22 in our music aid.
Good morning. I'm the Reverend Arthur Lavoie. Delighted to be here with you this morning. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I invite you to join with me in saying the words to our chalice lighting. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, to speak the truth in love, and to help one another.
So I found a woman, a minister, a Universalist minister that I had never heard of. Not that I know everything, but this one's worth knowing. Her name is Eliza Tupperwilks, and here is her story. Imagine traveling by horse and buggy along dusty, dirty roads in the summer heat, fording streams, swapping at mosquitoes, wearing clothes with long sleeves and high collars, or making the same trip on icy roads, beginning in the dark of the cold winter morning, whipped by wind with sleet stinging your face. Imagine that a church congregation is waiting for you when you reach your destination. You preach a sermon, lead the hymns, meet with the church officers, give counsel to troubled parishioners, help organize a church supper or an evening discussion group. Then, at the end of the day, perhaps you receive news of a death in another town, and you know you must soon be on the road again to comfort the grieving family. A day like this might have been a typical Sunday for a Universalist minister in the group known as the Iowa Sisterhood. These ministers were among the first female ministers in the United States. They endured hardships to bring liberal religion to the small communities that were springing up throughout the Midwest after the Civil War. Eliza Tupperwilks led the way in this new style of ministry. Eliza was born in Maine in 1844. Her father was a Baptist minister, and her mother was a writer and editor. Her mother's job was the usual, sort of. She had a job. In those days, married women rarely had professions outside of housekeeping. When Eliza was 5, her family moved to Iowa, a territory that had gained statehood only a few years earlier. When Eliza was 5, her family took a chance. People were flocking to this promising new state, and they were rolling with prairie lands and all the wonders of the world. The population had doubled from 75,000 when Eliza was born to 150,000 by the time she moved there at 5 years old. Pioneer life suited the Tupper family very well. A good high school education, though, was hard to find on the frontier, so Eliza was sent back to Maine to live with her grandfather to go to school. She returned to Iowa 3 years later and began studying at the new Baptist college. She wanted to become a missionary. After graduation, she took a job as a teacher in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. While she was there, her ideas about religion began to change. To the horror of her family, she decided to join the Universalists. When she was baptized in her new faith, she quipped that she had left the devil behind. The Universalist Church was the first denomination to welcome women ministers. This was lucky for Eliza Tupper. Her interest in the missionary work was still strong, and she began preaching from the pulpit at Mount Pleasant Universalist Church. She moved to Wisconsin, where she had her own pulpit as minister. Like Reverend Art is for our congregation, she was the center figure. While in Wisconsin, she met William Wilkes, a young law clerk, and she married him. The United States was a country on the move in these days. By 1869, you could take a train across the continent from East Coast to West. More and more people were striking out. In 1878, the family was on the move again. They traveled to the Dakota Territory and settled on the frontier town of Sioux Falls. Eliza's family eventually had 6 children. Unlike other prosperous husbands of these times, Eliza's husband approved of her career. He willingly paid for household help and tutors for the children so that Eliza could continue her missionary work. She was interested in many kinds of social reform, but she dedicated her life most of all to the establishment of new churches. She knew that among the pioneers in the frontier, there were many free-thinking people who hungered to hear the liberal message, and there were few places to hear it. From her home base in Sioux Falls, Eliza organized 7 churches in South Dakota, Iowa, and Minnesota. Her plan was to turn each church over to another minister after it was established, hopefully a female minister. Reverend Eliza Wilkes spent many years on the circuit, traveling from town to town, ministering to as many people as she could. On Sunday, she often preached in Rock Rapids, Iowa in the morning, then traveled 15 minutes to Laverne, Minnesota to do an afternoon service. Nowadays, such a trip would be a quick drive, but then it was a long and arduous journey over difficult roads. Eliza was a trailblazer, but she was not alone. Other women were establishing Unitarian churches in Iowa and the surrounding states. Women ministers encouraged other women to come into the ministry, and the Sisterhood grew. They often faced people who were hostile at the idea of women in ministry, but they proved to be so effective that their congregations in the Midwest and West grew quickly. After Eliza started a new congregation, she preferred to turn it over to those women. She believed that women brought to local areas more competent care. It wasn't just in the pulpit. Women better understood the people they served, unlike some of the men. Along with their religious message of optimism and hope, the women ministers tended to bring a comforting, home-like quality to church meetings that attracted both women and men. And beyond their religious duties, they often organized cultural and social events that were much appreciated by the people living in isolation. Women ministers are still very rare to the rest of the world. Even among Unitarians and Universalists, many people still disapproved of them. But for the young congregation of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, female ministers were the norm, thanks to the dedicated and hard work of these courageous women.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Andy Loretz. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm here to give you a little testimonial today about my experience with Unitarian Universalism. And so to start from the very beginning, I grew up as a Catholic, but my mom, in order to marry my dad, had to convert from her Lutheran ways to Catholicism. So even growing up, I always had Catholicism with a hint of Protestantism, and kind of was able to, take out bits and pieces from that. And what I loved about the Catholic Church when I was growing up was that sense of ritual and that sense of stewardship, of giving your time, talent, and treasure. That was always kind of impressed upon us. But as I was growing up, obviously, there were things about Catholicism that I had some disagreements, specifically along the lines of dogma. And as I grew older, I realized, I don't know where I stand with my faith. Kind of abandoned faith for a while. After moving to Plymouth, Jim and Anne Marie Schultz and the Jaegers, they kind of were like second, family to us. Kind of really took us under our wing, and we began to get to know them and began to get to know that, oh yeah, they're also Unitarian Universalists. Our first experience with this parish was actually at, I believe it was either Frank or Hannah's bridging ceremony. And that was just so beautiful to me. I remember sitting in the meeting house and just literally looking around and being like, well, this is really cool, like this space itself, and the history of this space, but also the ritual of the ceremony too. I really enjoyed the fact that it was up to the individual to decide what they were going to talk about, what was important to them. And that really spoke to me and really called to me. And so several years later after that, Adam and I were about to get married, and we were saying, we kind of want some structure of faith in our life. And this was it. It really filled the need, because specifically of kind of what Deb Keller-Wood was just talking about, of our commitment to turning over those stones, right? Of talking about women in our church, or Reverend Art's sermons on kind of the troubled past of our parish itself, right? We don't leave things unsaid. We confront our past and our history, and we try and live our values. At the same time, we don't make someone have a creed or a dogma to follow. So those things have always been super attractive to me about our parish, and about the Unitarian Universalist experience. And so I try and do my small part during pledge drives, to make sure that I'm giving back where I can, and I hope I can encourage people to do the same at some point. But we love it here, and we're just very excited to continue our journey with this parish over many, many years. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Andy. Today, our reading is The Ideal Unitarian Church by Reverend Celia Parker Woolley. The inevitable conclusion reached by a review of the past is that this ideal Unitarian church must rest on the broadest possible basis of fellowship, welcoming to its communion all thoughtful, truth-seeking minds, that any basis of fellowship recognizes the necessity of religious change and progress, and makes character, not creed, the test of religious life. The ideal church will be a recognized agency in the work of modern culture, the intellectual center of the neighborhood. Only as the church itself becomes a leader in the world of thought can it command the respect of thinking men and women. In its relation to the social questions of the hour, the ideal church is the type of a helpful and progressive humanity, made intelligent through culture and the experience of life. Its office is to help the needy and comfort the afflicted, but in ways that shall increase, not diminish, the general sum of self-respect. It aims to further the spirit of a noble self-reliance in all people, morally as well as intellectually, to establish more enlightened methods in the administration of charity and justice, and cultivate a deep sentiment of humanity. Our ideal church, what is it then? Primarily this: a religious organization whose basis of spiritual union lies deeper than any statement of belief can possibly reach, in the natural emotions of love, awe, and gratitude common to all people, emotions that rise with the contemplation of the great mysteries of nature and being. How happy are we to have gained a vision of this church, whose scripture is written through the good and great of all time, whose worship is the setting of the soul in tune with nature and the laws of its own being, whose communion is that of brotherly and sisterly kindness and love, and whose crowning object is attained in a perfected humanity, freed from all error, suffering, and crime, the ideal of which leans toward us through the centuries, at once the witness and reward of all of our efforts. And now for our musical reflection.
We laugh, we cry, we live, we die, we dance, we sing our song. We need to feel there's something here to which we can belong. We need to feel the freedom just to have some time alone. But most of all, we need close friends we can call our very own. And we believe in life and in the strength of love. And we have found our need to be together. We have our hearts to give. We have our thoughts to receive. And we believe that sharing is an answer. We seek elusive answers to the questions of this life. We seek to put an end to all the waste of human strife. We search for truth, equality, and blessed peace of mind. And then we come together here to make sense of what we find. And we believe in life and in the strength of love. And we have found our joy being together. And in our search for peace, baby, we'll finally see. Even to question truly is an answer.
Is there anything happening? Can't hear it. I can't hear anything either.
When I was studying for the ministry, I did my internship at the First Unitarian Church of Orlando, Florida. You see, I first came to Unitarian Universalism while living in Northampton, Massachusetts, and I moved to Berkeley, California to go to seminary. And so I wanted to experience Unitarian Universalism in another part of the country on my internship. When I arrived in Orlando in August of 1999, I got my first tour of the church and the 3 buildings that make up the campus of this thriving mid-sized UU church. When I walked into the church's parlor, my eyes were almost immediately drawn to this beautiful portrait of a woman that hung above the mantle. Marnie, the minister, when I asked, told me, "That's Eleanor Gordon. She was the founding minister of this church in 1902. I was stunned. A woman, I wondered, being the founding minister of a church as far back as 1902. I knew about Olympia Brown and a couple of other Universalist women who were ordained ministers around the middle of the 19th century. but had not heard of Eleanor Gordon. Now, one of the books that I planned to read while I was on my internship in Florida was this book here, Prophetic Sisterhood, by Cynthia Grant Tucker. And I knew it was about a handful of women who were ministers out in the Midwest. But a woman minister in Florida? I had no idea. But there was Eleanor, smiling down at me from her place of honor in that church's history, compelling me to learn more about her and the other women who served our movement at that time. And another little tidbit of information while Deb was telling her story about Eliza Tupperwilks, I looked her up and she's one of the people listed in this book. And it turns out that she was also one of the very first people to have dual fellowship as a Unitarian and Universalist minister, which is a fun thing because at that time in history, we were two separate denominations. In the second half of the 19th century, cities were growing all over the East Coast, and the westward expansion had taken Euro-American settlers over the Appalachian Mountains to the vast plains states. In fact, the Mississippi River was considered the western frontier. When the Unitarians decided to set up an office to help establish churches on the frontier, they chose Chicago as the headquarters for the Western Conference. Even though there were some settlements in California due to the gold rush, the vast expanse in the western half of the continental US was considered to be mostly wild, uncharted, and unsafe territory, at least from the dominant Eurocentric perspective. Racism and genocide were alive and well, and our government was in the process of what many considered to be the genocide of American Indians and forcing those that survived onto reservations. This part of our story begins in the late 1850s. Let's picture for a moment a family farm in Hamilton, Illinois, near the banks of the Mississippi River. There is a child standing on a tree stump preaching. Her name is Mary Augusta Safford, and she would often entertain her family and the farm animals in this way. She was born on that farm in 1851 and would become the pivotal figure in an emerging constellation of clergywomen who dominated the Unitarian Church's development on the frontier for the rest of the 19th century. Mary's father, Stephen, was a farmer and a teacher. He was outspoken about some radical notions for his day, such as the abolition of slavery, the fallibility of the Bible, and the new Darwinian theory. In fact, he was sometimes called before his church board to justify his beliefs. It's no wonder Mary developed as a strong, independent thinker with some radical notions of her own. Eleanor Gordon, the very same Eleanor Gordon whose portrait stunned me in Orlando, was 9 months Mary's junior. She lived on a neighboring farm in Hamilton and came from a family with a diversity of religious beliefs. She had an uncle and an aunt who were Unitarian and another uncle who described himself as a spiritualist. Her mother's family was Baptist, and Eleanor looked forward to the lively debates that often occurred when the family got together. It was Eleanor among her siblings who picked up the family tradition of intellectual independence, and she quickly began to question traditional church teachings. Her indifference to the thoughts of hellfire and damnation helped both her and Mary to pursue their own intellectual and religious curiosity. They became good friends, though they were very different. Mary was tall and thin, fair with bright blue eyes. She had a radiance about her that gave her a spiritual quality. She was filled with energy and loved the limelight. Eleanor, on the other hand, was of average height with brown hair and a sturdy build. She was as earthy as Mary appeared ethereal, with a warm and hearty laugh. And while Mary thrived on being at the center of attention, Eleanor was much more of a behind-the-scenes organizer. Both young women attended college briefly at Iowa State University, but neither of their families could afford the tuition beyond the first year. So they continued their studies on their own, reading whatever seemed most appropriate. They found Theodore Parker, the Unitarian minister and abolitionist, to be their greatest hero. With the encouragement of a Unitarian minister across the river in Iowa, the two young women started a church in Hamilton, which quickly came to the attention of Jenkins Lloyd Jones. Jones was a Unitarian minister who had been sent to Chicago to serve as the Western Secretary of the American Unitarian Association. At that time, it was almost impossible to get any male clergy to work in this Western district, which was seen as the edge of civilization. So Jones was thrilled to find these two eager young women who felt called to ministry and who were from the area and knew its history and its culture. From his own experience growing up in rural Wisconsin, he understood the needs of the frontier. He also held a deep respect for women, their skills and abilities, and he mirrored that in his own marriage. Susan Barbara Jones was his partner and collaborator as well as his spouse. There was a fledgling group trying to start a church in Humboldt, Iowa. So Jones invited Eleanor and Mary to minister to that community. As it turned out, Humboldt was also looking for a principal for its school. So the ministerial careers of these two women began with Mary in the pulpit and Eleanor running the school. Over the course of the next several decades, Mary and Eleanor led a group of women who were at the forefront of the expansion of Unitarianism and Universalism into the new territories being settled on the Western frontier. We know them today, as Deb mentioned, as the Iowa Sisterhood. Now, in order to understand a bit more about what made it possible for women to become ministers in the second half of the 19th century, we have to examine some of the social conditions at that time in history. Most of the people moving west had left traditional family structures and had to band together with people they didn't know in order to survive. This forced them to be more open to a greater diversity of ideas and ways of thinking. Many traditional stereotypes were breaking down. Men and women had to work together to build their homes and till their fields. Tucker writes, "They brought their states into the Union with new sets of ground rules, laws that gave females unprecedented domestic rights and political voice. And as men were in chronically short supply, the women were also given a chance to break out of old roles and enter new professions. Female doctors, dentists, and lawyers who could not get licensed back east were given a hearty welcome in frontier communities." The Sisterhood of Women in Ministry was thus able to emerge and be successful in Iowa and in the West. The women, in turn, brought a new style of ministry to these communities. Let's think for a minute about what traditional Unitarianism looked like at that time. For one thing, it was very stuffy and over-intellectualized. Ministers spent most of the week researching and writing long sermon treatises. Church was often characterized by weekly pulpit appearances and a more aloof pastoral style. Most of the charity work or care of people in need was left to the Women's Alliance. Communities in the West had far different concerns. There weren't extended families to provide care and support for people. Education and social services were practically non-existent. People lived on the edge, creating social structures as they went along. The church could take on a far stronger role in building communities. It became a place of learning throughout the week. There were classes in everything from basic homemaking, skills to reading, writing, arithmetic, from health and hygiene to religious values. The churches also opened the doors to new forms of social justice work in their communities. Where women's alliances in the East had little power and authority, they now became groups based on self-affirmation. These women ministers brought a commitment to a 7-day-a-week ministry that could offer protection, comfort, and nourishment to deal with the problems of poverty, sickness, and climate that affected people in these rural areas. The church became more of a home, and the congregation was asked to see itself as a family with all of the privileges and responsibilities which that entails. The intellectualism of the religious system was transformed by the emphasis on community service and current affairs. This religion of doing and being was as radical as it was refreshing within the Unitarian denomination. And this radicalism brought trouble for these pioneering ministers. The Unitarian establishment back east was not willing to allow women a full voice in the life of the church and continued to be condescending and demeaning of their ministry. The American Unitarian Association, as it was called at the time, failed to understand the nature of Western methods and the style of mission work that was needed to grow congregations. After Jenkins Lloyd-Jones resigned as the Western Secretary, it became clear how unwilling the association was to give up their patriarchal hold on power. As we move into the early part of the 20th century, women in the Unitarian Church were actively discouraged from entering the ministry, and women who were already ordained were denied pulpits and were asked instead to run Sunday schools rather than to minister to congregations. The Western communities which they served were also beginning to change. Frontier towns and cities became more settled and more conservative, losing much of the adventurous spirit in which they had been founded. As people became more conservative, they were also less accepting of the social justice focus of preaching, which was at the heart of these women's message. Even though there were 70 women in ministry, 70 women in ministry by 1890, many of them could not secure pulpits, and they remained a largely unnoticed presence. Many of these women shifted their ministries into what we would today call community ministry. Several of them worked in establishing and existing settlement houses, modeled after Hull House of Chicago. And they were started in several cities to help new immigrants and new people moving into the area. Some of them also got involved in the women's suffrage movement. And a few of them, like Eleanor Gordon, moved to places like Florida, where they were still able to secure church pulpits. And their story remained largely untold until Cynthia Grant Tucker's book brought their story to the larger audience. It wasn't until the later part of the 20th century before women's voices were heard and respected from our pulpits again. And they have shared some of the same struggles for recognition and affirmation as their foremothers. Today, more than 50% of the ordained ministers in the Unitarian Universalist Association are women. And the influence of women has forever changed our ministry. We have now all adopted the more intimate pastoral style in our churches and our collegial style among clergy, which they pioneered. Knowing that church is a place where we care for each other and the larger community is now an expected part of our self-definition. Mary Safford wrote that true religion must first of all be free religion, free from a rational dogma that discourages personal growth. It must be understood as part of human experience, as something as real as the law of gravity or the solar system. It must be put to the test of reason in people's everyday living, and like the modern world, was best understood as a process that is worked through a community. May the lives and the works of our prophetic mothers and foremothers in ministry never be forgotten again. Our closing hymn is One More Step. Joyce Poley is a Unitarian Universalist songwriter from Canada. Many pieces by her in our hymnal and that we are using in our worship. So, love that she's with us today as well. As Unitarian Universalists, we understand that every prayer, every song, every word that comes from our hearts and souls is important and needs to be heard. And let us all rejoice that all of our voices are welcome in this world of ideas, in our spirituality, in our church, in our religious movement. May it always be so.